Do you believe a Bigfoot once saved a stranded family during a deadly snowstorm, and the only human it trusted was a 78-year-old widower who lost his only son decades ago? The truth is, not everyone hunts monsters. Some just leave a bowl of hot soup on their porch every night without a word. That silent act of kindness sparked a bond no one could have imagined and changed a whole town. This is a story revealed through the private journals of Avery Hartline, an ecologist who lived on the edge of the Adirondacks and kept this secret for nearly 30 years. In the next 5 minutes, you'll learn why an entire town built a wooden bridge to honor a creature they once feared, and what made its worst enemy, a ruthless trapper, kneel before it in awe. Walter Holloway, a retired carpenter grieving his son's death on thin ice, once nursed a wounded young Bigfoot back to health. The night Walter passed away, locals swear they heard a strange whistling, echoing through the pines. His wooden grave marker bears only a bowl of soup, and the words, "Leave a place kinder than you found it." Don't scroll away. If you've ever thought Bigfoot was just a myth, this story may change your mind. And tonight, if the wind whistles just right, you might start listening differently. The wind had teeth that night. It sank through the firs like breath through a cracked door, rattling dry pine needles and sliding across the frozen beams of an old wooden cabin at the edge of South Meadow. The light inside was a slow heartbeat, golden and small. A single oil lamp on the counter flickered with each gust, casting long quivering shadows across the chinked logs. The soup pot simmered soft and low on the iron stove, and beside it, a man stirred without hurry. Walter Holloway, 78 and carved by years like the Adirondacks themselves, moved with care. His hands, calloused and veined like tree bark, hovered over the steam rising from rabbit broth and wild onion. He didn't measure, didn't taste. He just knew when it was ready. The scent drifted through the cabin, touched the frayed curtains, brushed the old rocking chair by the hearth. The place was worn but clean. Every board had his handprint in it. Every drawer still closed with the exact fit of a carpenter's patience. And every winter, he kept it warm with memory. On the coat hook by the door hung his heavy wool jacket, one inner pocket stitched over and over with quiet reverence. Inside that pocket, always, was a small square of quilted fabric, blue-gray and faded, rough from years of handling. It had once belonged to his son, Daniel, from a shirt he wore the week before the ice broke, the week before the scream never came. Walter stirred the soup one more time and turned off the flame. The wind curled around the eaves again, stronger this time, and the trees leaned into one another like nervous horses. Then something shifted. A sound, but not quite a sound. It wasn't branch, nor beast, nor wind. A whistle, soft. 3 notes, long, long, short. His spine went still. He didn't move right away. Just stood there, soup ladle hanging in one hand, his other resting unconsciously against his chest, against the square in his pocket. Another gust of wind. Then silence. Then footsteps. Not boots, not hooves, but something heavier than deer, lighter than moose. Careful, deliberate. Walter reached for the old axe on the wall, then stopped himself. He didn't know why. Maybe it was the whistle. Maybe it was the way the hairs stood on his forearms like dogs listening. He set the ladle down, unlatched the door, pulled it open just enough for the cold to slip in like a knife. The porch groaned under the weight of the wind. Snow drifted across the steps, and at the far edge of the lantern light, there, placed neatly on the top stair, lay a piece of wood, smoothed, palm-sized, still shiny with fresh resin, and across its flat surface, faint but deliberate, a single smear of pine pitch curved like a symbol, not scribbled, etched. Walter bent down slowly, knees crackling. He picked up the wood, turned it over in his hand. It was warm, not from sun, not from house, from breath. Beside it, just beyond the steps, something else. A footprint, huge, clear, unmistakable. 5 toes, wide ball, deep arch, and longer than his boot by several inches. No human left that. No bear either. His breath caught behind his ribs. For a moment, all he could do was stare. The snow had taken it perfectly. No melt, no collapse. The print was new, minutes old. He stood slowly. His eyes scanned the dark. Nothing moved, but the trees felt too still. He didn't speak, didn't call out. Instead, he turned back into the cabin, set the small wooden token on the counter, then ladled a bowl of soup, hot, generous, thick with meat, took a heel of rye bread from the tin, carried both back outside. He didn't go far, just to the edge of the porch. Kneeling, he placed the bowl carefully on the top step, set the bread beside it, then straightened up, took one step back, then another. He didn't shut the door, just stood inside the frame, barely lit by the lamp behind him, hands by his sides, and he waited. Long minutes passed. Nothing. He almost turned. But then, beyond the drift, something shifted. A shadow too tall to be man, too still to be moose, moved from behind a white pine. It didn't step forward. It unfolded, like a shape melting from the forest itself, taller than the door frame. Shoulders that filled the space between 2 trees, breath clouding in long, slow exhales. It didn't look at him, didn't make a sound, just stood there. Then, with a motion so quiet it barely stirred the snow, it took one step forward, another, closer. The porch creaked. Walter held his breath. The shape knelt, slowly, as if its bones were old too. One long arm reached forward, dark and heavy. Fingers, yes, fingers, curled around the bowl, lifted it. Steam rose between them like a veil. It sniffed, waited, then, spoonless, brought the bowl to its mouth, tilted it, drank, carefully, savoring. It placed the bowl back down just as gently. Then the bread. Then it turned its head slightly, not quite toward Walter, but not away either. The light caught the edge of its face. Not a mask, not a trick of light. A brow deep like stone, a jaw furred but smooth in places, as if old scars had once cleared paths. And eyes, darker than night, but awake. Then it stood, still watching. It didn't leave yet. Instead, it reached down again, set another object on the stair. This one even smaller. Another piece of wood. But this time, clean, unsmeared, still wet with sap. It lingered a moment longer, just enough for its breath to fog the edge of the light. Then it turned, disappearing between the trees like wind through snow. No sound, no snapping branches. Gone. Walter stood in the doorway a long while. The lamp behind him flickered lower. His hands didn't shake, but his breath came shallow, almost apologetic. He stepped forward, picked up the second piece of wood. This one was warmer than the first. He held both tokens in one palm, then looked up. Out there, the trees closed behind the shadow like theater curtains. Snow began to fall again, gentle as ash. He shut the door, latched it slow, sat in the chair by the hearth and stared at the fire that hadn't gone out. He didn't sleep much that night, because something about that whistle, long, short, he'd heard it once before. A night not unlike this. Winter of '78, the week the lake cracked open and swallowed his boy. There'd been a sound that night, too. Far off, faint. A pattern lost in the wind. But he hadn't moved then, hadn't gone looking. Now he wondered if he should have. Morning came thin and pale, sliding across the windows like frost. He set the 2 pieces of wood side by side on the mantel. One marked, one clean. He didn't write anything down, didn't tell anyone. But when he left to chop wood that morning, he checked the steps behind him 3 times. And when the wind picked up again that evening, he paused, just for a second, to listen. And the trees, they answered nothing. But that silence carried weight, like a promise unspoken, like something watching, waiting. And so he cooked 2 bowls that night, not just one, and left the door unlatched. 3 days later, the snow turned a rusted brown near the edge of the clearing. It started with a faint trail, like something had been dragged, heavy, slow, and struggling. The blood wasn't red anymore. It had dried into the ice like old tobacco spit, dark and flaking. Walter had just come out to split kindling when he saw it. No animal he'd ever known bled like that. No predator he knew dragged prey in that pattern. This wasn't a kill, it was an approach. Intentional. And wounded. He followed it past the water barrel, around the side of the cabin where the snow collected thicker in the shadow. The line stopped just shy of the stump he used to sit on in the evenings, back when the bones in his legs still agreed with the cold. There, just beyond the reach of the firewood pile, the trees parted, and the forest breathed. They didn't storm in, didn't crash branches or howl like stories like to tell it. They waited. The matriarch stood still as a monument, her form carved in dusk shadow, half veiled behind frost-tipped limbs. She was taller than he remembered, broader. Her chest rose like a furnace about to go cold. The fur down her front caught the light of his cabin window, and where the thick dark hair parted, he saw it. The faint glint of silver near her collar, like old pine bark touched by moonlight. She didn't move, not an inch. But beside her, leaning into her thigh for balance, was a smaller figure, thinner, shaking. One leg bent the wrong way at the joint. Walter didn't need to think. He just did what instinct told him, the same way he used to move when his son cried out in the dark from leg cramps as a boy. He backed up, slow, hands out, no threat, then turned. The cabin door creaked open, warm light spilling out onto the snow like honey. He moved through it quick, pulled the old chest open beneath the window. His wife's wool blanket, green, striped, pilled from decades of use, still smelled faintly of cedar and fireplace. He grabbed it. 2 buckets, filled them half with snow, half with water from the kettle. 1 roll of linen gauze, mortar, a small handful of dried willow bark. His hands knew this rhythm. His knees groaned with each bend, but nothing in him hesitated. Outside, the boy still stood, barely. Walter didn't speak. He crouched in the snow and laid the blanket out wide, like a field being offered. Then he took the buckets and placed one on each side, not to trap, to signal. A soft fence, a message without words. No one's going to cage you. You're free to leave if you want. The matriarch stepped back. She didn't push the boy forward. She didn't motion. But slowly, so slowly it hurt to watch. The younger one shifted. He limped once, then again. The sound his foot made when it hit the snow made Walter wince. He was in pain, deep bone-level pain, but he kept going. When he reached the blanket, he didn't lie down. He sat, cross-legged, like a child who wasn't sure if this was punishment or kindness. Walter joined him, one knee cracking as he knelt beside him. The leg was bad. The old snare scar had been reopened, the skin purpled and bulging around torn muscle. The boy's breath was fast, but his eyes, those dark, wet eyes, watched every move Walter made with a kind of fierce attention. Not fear, just caution shaped by too much pain. Walter held the willow bark between his palms, rolled it until the oils began to seep, then ground it, mixed it with snow, packed it into a soft pulp, and pressed it gently to the swollen tissue. The boy flinched. Guttural breath, no growl, just tension. Walter dipped the linen in warm water, wrung it out, then began wrapping. Not tight, just firm enough to hold the limb. He spoke softly, not to be understood, but to remind himself he was still human. "You're all right now. I got you. You're not alone." It was the kind of thing you say to a lost fawn or a dying son. And the matriarch never stepped forward. She stood beneath the tree line like a statue of something older than the forest. Her gaze didn't waver. Her hands hung at her sides, open, still. Trust held together by a thread as thin as breath. Walter reached into the pocket of his coat, the same one, the only one he wore this time of year. He let his fingers rest on the patch of Daniel's quilted shirt. He didn't pull it out. Just let it warm his hand. Then he took the spoon. Steam rose from the pot in the crook of his arm. He'd brought it out. Didn't even remember doing it. Maybe the old habits knew better than memory. The soup was thicker tonight. More barley, more bone. He scooped a small spoonful, blew gently across the surface, then held it out. The boy looked at it, then at him, then slowly leaned forward and accepted it. One spoon, then another. The wind shifted, and the matriarch exhaled. Walter didn't look up. He kept feeding the boy, letting the rhythm settle. There was no rush. Only snow falling slow as time. Hours passed like that. Later, when the stars began to emerge behind clouds like faces behind frost, the two figures backed away. The boy limped, but less so. The matriarch stepped into the dark without a sound. Walter didn't speak. He didn't wave. He just sat on the blanket, knees stiff, hands tingling from cold, and stared at the crushed snow where they'd been. Behind him, the window glowed faintly, the lamp low, the stove dying down. He didn't move until the wind changed again. Back in town, Baxter's diner was full of louder things. Spoons clinking on mugs, boots stomping melted snow off rubber mats. Gossip spun like smoke. And always, in towns like this, there's someone louder than the rest. Rafe Maddox slammed his palm on the bar and said what the others wouldn't. I'm telling you, it's not bear. It's not wolves. It's that damn thing they say's been living out by the ridge. The one dragging deer carcasses and scaring the dogs silent. He said it like a man who wanted attention, and he got it. Some laughed, some leaned closer, but Rafe wasn't joking. He pulled a napkin across the bar, drew a crude shape with the end of a stir stick dipped in ketchup. Foot like that, bigger than mine by half. If it's still limping, it's vulnerable. You don't wait on chances like this. A man down the counter shook his head. It's winter. You start messing with things in winter, you end up on the news. Rafe smirked. Or in the money. He didn't say the rest out loud. That a drifter named Mac Riordan had passed through last fall, talking about training exotic animals for big city shows. That a rare find could fetch 5 digits easy. That some creatures didn't need to live to be valuable. He didn't have to say it. The seed was planted. Back on South Meadow, the fire had died. Walter sat in silence, fingers curled tight around his empty mug. The boy's foot had bled through the wrap. He'd placed the bloody cloth beside the hearth to dry. He'd grind more willow in the morning. He opened the drawer near the sink, pulled out a small wooden box, untouched for years. Inside, among old nails and screws and a rusted harmonica, lay a piece of wire, twisted, sharp, curled like a question mark. A snare he'd found in 1978, near where Daniel went through the ice. He turned it over slowly in his hands. It was the same kind of wire that had cut the boy's leg tonight. He closed the box and slid it back. Outside, the wind brushed the door like a hand testing the lock. And later that night, just before sleep finally dragged him under, he heard it. Not one, but two. From 2 different places in the trees. And his heart, tired as it was, remembered something deeper than fear. He wasn't alone anymore, and neither were they. It was just after sunrise when the knock came. Not the whistle, not the wind, but an honest-to-God knock on the door, firm, fast, unmistakably human. Walter had barely finished his coffee, the metal mug still warm between his hands. He froze mid-sip, eyes flicking to the window, then to the door. A second knock followed, more patient than the first. He stood slowly, stiff joints resisting the morning cold. His hand brushed the inside of his jacket pocket without thinking, feeling for the familiar square of quilted fabric. It was still there, still tucked where it always was. He opened the door. She stood bundled in field greens and canvas, snow crusted at the knees of her pants, a dark braid poking out beneath her knit cap. 30-something, maybe a bit more, with cheeks flushed not from embarrassment, but from cold and determination. She held a notebook in one gloved hand, the other resting near a utility belt cinched at her hip. Her eyes weren't wide with fear or surprise. They were sharp, full of questions, but not the kind that demanded answers. The kind that measured them. "Avery Hartline," she said. "Adirondack Ecological Survey." Walter squinted at her, then shifted just enough to block the inside of the cabin. "I was following a blood trail," she added. "Faded but distinct. Led straight here." He didn't say anything. Not at first. The silence between them stretched thin. She held up the notebook. "I'm not with law enforcement. Not here to cause trouble. Just want to understand what's moving through these woods." Her voice had the steadiness of someone used to climbing alone, sleeping in tents, waking to the sounds of things that might be more than deer. Walter looked past her shoulder, to where faint tracks were beginning to fill with fresh powder. And then he stepped aside. Inside, the heat from the stove reached her in waves. She didn't look surprised by the dimness or the smell of oil and stew. But when she turned her head and saw the corner where the young one sat, she drew in a slow, sharp breath. He was huddled on the blanket still, one leg stretched awkwardly, wrapped in linen now darkened with seeped blood. Beside him was an empty wooden bowl and a small towel soaked with sap and steam. He looked up at her without moving. Silent. Watching. Avery didn't scream, didn't move for her belt, didn't even reach for the pen in her book. She just stared. Walter closed the door behind her and moved back toward the stove, pretending to tend to the pot, though his eyes never left her face. She stepped closer, one careful footfall at a time, like approaching the edge of a frozen lake. "You're treating him," she said finally, softly. Walter gave the faintest nod. She turned to him. "How long?" "Since 3 nights back," he replied. "And the matriarch?" Walter glanced toward the window. "She don't come inside." Avery blinked slowly. She crouched, resting on the balls of her feet, careful not to reach out. Just observing. The young one didn't flinch. His breathing stayed even, though he kept his body turned slightly toward the door, toward the trees. "I've heard rumors," she said. "Bits of old stories, footprints, hair samples with no match. But I never thought I'd see it." Walter didn't answer. The room was warm, but not comforting. Not yet. Avery stood again, pulled off her gloves, opened the notebook, and on the inside cover, next to a pressed leaf and faded topographic sketch, she drew 3 marks. Long, long, short. Then she closed it. Walter's jaw tightened a bit. She looked him in the eye. "I don't think this belongs in any report." "No," he said quietly. She nodded once. Outside, wind whispered through the eaves again, brushing the corners of the cabin. A sound not unlike breath. Avery took a seat at the old table without being asked. Not to pry, just to wait. There was something in the air now, unspoken but mutual. At the sheriff's office that same morning, Lula Grimes poured her coffee black and hot, leaning against the edge of her desk while a deputy rattled off something about more rumors coming out of Baxter's. Shadow sightings, whistles, strange shapes behind the tree line. She didn't write anything down. Just sighed, sipped, and muttered, "It's winter. Cabin fever's setting in." But the name Rafe Maddox did come up again, and that she didn't ignore. Lula knew the kind of trouble that wore a plaid jacket and stomped through snow like it owned the mountain. She made a mental note to drive out toward Johns Brook the next day. Back at Baxter's, Rafe sat at the counter, flipping a hunting knife open and shut with one hand while the other cradled a mug of cheap brew. A couple younger guys leaned in, pretending not to listen while he spoke just loud enough to be heard. "Whatever's out there ain't just lurking. It's getting bolder. Someone needs to set some lines before it starts dragging kids off back porches." One of the younger ones laughed nervously. "You think it's gonna knock first?" Rafe grinned. "I think it already has." That night, a fresh round of snare traps went down along the ridge, wire teeth in the snow, hidden beneath frost and leaves. Rafe wasn't alone anymore. The fear had grown legs, and legs bring action. But not all action is wisdom. Back in the cabin, Birchstep had started drawing. Walter noticed it first when the boy pressed his finger into the frost on the window pane. Slow, deliberate strokes. At first, it looked like nothing more than streaks. Then Walter saw the rhythm. He was mimicking it, remembering it, understanding it. Avery watched from the table, the low lamplight catching the edge of her cheek. Her lips parted just slightly in surprise. She stood and walked to the window, then reached out with one bare fingertip and added a small mark beside his. He stared at it, then met her eyes. Not a word passed between them, but something shifted. Later that evening, long after the stew was gone and the cabin quiet again, Walter opened the front door to let out the steam and check the wood pile. Snow had started again, thin flakes tumbling sideways through the dark. He bent down to pull a fresh log, but stopped halfway. There on the step was another piece of wood, but different, smaller, lighter. Birch, not pine. Smoothed, but not coated in resin. No pitch, no scent, just clean grain, pale and fine like polished bone. He picked it up, turned it in his hand. A message, maybe, or a summons. Something was changing. The signs were more deliberate now. This wasn't just survival. It was contact. And somewhere beyond the trees, between the wind and the dark, more of them were listening. The wind had turned metallic by morning. It hissed down from the ridgelines like a blade drawn through birch trees, dry and sharp and filled with warning. Snow didn't fall. It flew, horizontal and wild. By the time Avery made it to the edge of South Meadow, her coat was thick with it, her breath hard. The trail behind her vanished in seconds. She banged on Walter's door with her glove before the storm could swallow her. He opened it without a word, like he'd been waiting. "They're stuck," she panted. "Morris family. Up near Marcy Notch. Their Jeep spun out. No radio." Walter didn't ask how she knew. He didn't ask why she came to him. He just turned, grabbed his coat from the peg, and reached for the gear he kept ready without reason. The small axe, the rope, the thick wool blanket folded in a canvas satchel, and in the inside pocket of that same jacket, the square of channeled fabric from Daniel's shirt, soft and worn and steady as breath. Avery caught her own breath, leaning against the wall while Walter packed the oil lamp, its glass already fogging in the sudden heat from their boots. She saw the way he moved, less like an old man, and more like someone who remembered exactly what cold could do to a body left alone too long. They stepped outside, and the world vanished. White roared in every direction. Trees blurred. The sky and ground were the same endless smear. Avery's compass jittered in her hand. Wind yanked the scarf from her neck before she could tighten it. They moved low and slow, walking single file, heads down, boots crunching snow hardened like glass. Every 10 steps they stopped to listen. Not for voices, for the whistle. It came soft, almost too soft to hear beneath the wail of storm. But it was there, carried on a current colder than death, slicing sideways between the maples. Long, long, short. They turned toward it without speaking, and there she was, a shadow at first, still and towering and impossibly calm in the storm. The matriarch stood between 2 hemlocks, her frame half covered in drifted snow, as if the storm had risen around her and not through her. Her eyes were unreadable, but her posture said one thing: follow. Walter didn't hesitate. He moved after her, one hand on the rope in case Avery lost pace behind him. The matriarch walked ahead, not close, never touching the path they walked, but always visible. Just enough. A beacon made of bone and breath. She didn't rush. She never looked back. When the trail forked, she paused. When a tree had fallen across the pass, she moved toward the left slope and waited. She didn't lead. She guided. And behind them, just barely visible through the curtain of snow, Birch Step followed. He moved slow, his limp still present, but more practiced now. He watched the ground. He carried no burden, said no sound. But when Avery slipped on a patch of black ice, it was Birch Step who stepped forward, not to catch her, but to pause beside her, to wait, then continue. She never forgot that. Hours passed like heartbeats. By the time they reached the ridge above the notch, Walter's beard was stiff with frost, and the lamp in his hand burned dim behind fogged glass. The Jeep was there, half buried, its wheels turned in opposite directions, one door open, snow packed against the inside. A woman's scarf fluttered from the side mirror. Walter and Avery ran. Jack Morris lay against the passenger door, legs bent wrong, eyes open but vacant with pain. His ankle had broken clean through his boot. Avery dropped beside him, whispered something about splints, about keeping him warm, about holding still. Darlene sat in the back, wrapped around her daughter, teeth chattering too fast for speech. The girl, Sadie, was pale, not shivering anymore, too far gone. Walter didn't pause. He wrapped her in the wool blanket, then took off his own coat and wrapped that around her too. She didn't flinch, just leaned into him like sleep. He pulled her close to his chest, holding her like he remembered holding Daniel when he was still small enough to carry up the stairs after falling asleep in the truck. "We have to move now," Avery shouted. "If they stay out here." Walter nodded. He adjusted Sadie's weight and turned toward the matriarch, who now stood just a little closer. She didn't speak, didn't reach out, but she waited. Avery hauled Jack's weight across her shoulders, wincing with each step, while Darlene followed behind, hands gripping the tail of Walter's coat like she might disappear if she let go. The wind rose again, harder this time. Walter staggered once on a slick incline, his foot slipping beneath a hidden patch of ice. His knees buckled. Sadie's weight shifted. For a split second the whole world tilted, but the matriarch moved. Not fast, not panicked. Just there. She turned her body sideways, wide shoulder pressed against the wind, and stood close enough for Walter to lean. He caught himself against her side, not touching skin or fur, but body heat, the way a wall holds you up when your legs forget. Her chest expanded, a long, deep breath fogging the air in front of him, and for a moment, it felt like the mountain itself had exhaled through her ribs. He didn't speak, didn't thank her. She didn't expect him to. She moved again, slower now, her back just a few paces ahead, creating a break in the wind for the others to walk through. And then it happened, somewhere behind the trees, carried by a wind older than any storm. It came again. Not one, not a single whistle in the dark. But a chain, a sequence. Walter's heart stalled. His hands tightened around the child in his arms. That sound, that rhythm. He'd heard it once before. Winter of '78. The week Daniel died, he'd stood on the porch, holding a flashlight, listening to a noise he didn't understand. A pattern he didn't trust. And he hadn't followed it. Hadn't answered. He'd stayed inside. He kept walking now, through the snow, through the breathless silence, past the past. And when they reached the tree line beyond the meadow, just where town lights began to blur the storm, the matriarch stopped. She didn't look back. She just vanished. One step, gone. Birch Step paused longer. He watched them reach the edge. Watched Avery drop to her knees beside the Jeep. Watched Walter hand Sadie to the paramedics who had finally arrived. Watched the flashlights, the confusion, the noise. Then he turned and walked back into the trees. Walter stood alone, his arms empty, his coat gone, his breath rising. And across the field, from behind the plumes of emergency lights and steam, Rafe Maddox stood. He didn't blink, didn't speak, but he'd seen them. Silhouettes tall enough to block trees, moving like myths, real enough to leave tracks. His hand slid to the leather strap across his chest. He gripped the handle of the rifle slung on his back, and in his mind, something clicked. Not metal. Opportunity. And far behind him, hidden in the storm, someone else whistled. But the pattern was wrong, deliberately wrong. Mimicry without meaning, and it began to echo across the forest. By sunrise, the storm had passed, but the fire it left behind still clung to the ridge like a sickness that refused to die. Smoke rolled over South Meadow in low, bitter waves. curling around tree trunks and settling into the frozen soil. Birds didn't sing. Nothing moved. It was the kind of morning that made old men look to the hills and remember war. Walter stood on his porch with a mug that had long gone cold. Ash had fallen in the night, speckling the snow like scattered bone. He knew the ridge had burned. You could smell it deep in the chest. Pine resin gone acrid, bark turned to char. But it wasn't lightning that had lit it. This wasn't nature's hand. This was something meaner. Down in the town proper, Baxter's was already boiling, voices piled on top of each other, everybody with a version of the story. Darlene Morris had spoken quiet, still shaky from the rescue. Jack was in a leg brace. Little Sadie hadn't said much, just clung to her blanket like it still held the shape of the arms that carried her. Someone, no one knew who exactly, let it slip that they'd been helped by something bigger than a man, that a creature had led them down from the snow, towering and silent, moving with purpose. Maybe even more than one. And once those words hit the counter, the whole diner caught fire. Rafe Maddox stood up slow, hands planted on either side of his empty plate. "So it's real," he said. No one spoke. "You all laughed, said I was seeing things, said my traps were cruel. Now who's laughing?" He pulled a wrinkled sheet of paper from his coat pocket and slapped it on the table. A map. Hand-drawn. Circles, lines, notches in red pen that looked too thick and angry to come from anything but frustration. "I say we end this," he said, "before it gets closer." A man near the door leaned back. "Lula said not to go setting traps without permits. You remember that?" "I remember Lula isn't the one getting dragged through the woods by a monster." The laughter was dry, but weak. Rafe tapped the map again. "We bait it. We catch it. Hell, there's folks who'd pay damn good money for something like this, might even fund a new station for all I care." Someone coughed. Another drained their coffee. No one said yes, but no one said no either. That was enough. At the sheriff's office, Lula Grimes tossed another empty file into the outbox and rubbed her eyes with the heel of her hand. Avery had already been in once that morning, said something vague about migration corridors, about calling in colleagues for mapping support. But there was more behind her eyes, a pressure she wasn't speaking to. Lula knew that look, knew it from years of seeing good people keep secrets to protect something fragile. But secrets and fire don't mix. That afternoon, while the sky turned gray and thick with more waiting snow, Walter brought out a small iron pot from his shed. He'd cleaned it that morning, set water to boil on the stove, and laid out strips of cloth like a surgeon. Birch Step had taken his meal slow that day, the bruising around his knee fading but not gone. Walter sat with him in silence. No coaxing, just presence. Now and then, he'd ladle warm porridge into the bowl and pass it without ceremony. The boy took it, ate without fear now. When Walter reached down to check the muscle above the wound, Birch Step didn't flinch. Not once. He let Walter press along the joint, rotate the foot gently, check swelling. The trust between them had stopped needing words. It had become something felt. Later, as the sun slipped behind low clouds, Birch Step rose. He crossed the small room with a limp that had found rhythm, paused at the frost-glazed table near the window, reached out with one long, narrow finger and drew in the condensation. The symbol was clear, straight, confident. Walter stared at it, lips parting just slightly. The boy stepped back, then pressed both hands to the glass like he was sealing it in. Avery returned just before dusk, boots muddy from the trails, notebook strapped tight beneath her coat. She saw the symbol on the window and said nothing. Just stood beside it, pressed a thumb beside Birch Step's print, and waited. In the quiet, Walter opened a drawer near the stove, pulled out the small wooden box again. Inside, nestled beside rusted screws and an old harmonica, was a thin coil of wire, the same kind he'd found all those years ago, twisted like a question that never got answered. He held it in the firelight. The marks matched what had torn into Birch Step's leg. He closed the box. Outside, someone had placed a new sign just off the main road. Fresh pine, rough cut, carved by hand with a jackknife. High Peaks Passage. No entry beyond this point. Walter saw it when he went out to check the traps. His own, harmless ones, for raccoons and snowshoe hare. But this sign didn't carry an official seal. It wasn't from the Ranger Service. It was from the people. Carved not to claim, but to protect. Avery had been walking the edge of that corridor all day, clearing old flagging tape, planting small birch stakes into the snow. Markers, boundaries. There were no fences, only respect. But across the valley, under the canopy of blackened trees where the fire had eaten through 2 acres of old growth, Rafe worked in silence. He and 2 younger men, one his cousin, the other a seasonal worker who owed him favors, laid the traps along deer paths. Razor wire coiled in tight loops. Loops that pulled tight the harder something struggled. Hidden beneath leaves, disguised under snow, baited with old deer hides soaked in scent lure. Rafe had scouted it the day before. He knew where they moved. He'd seen the signs, and he knew they'd come. "They're not ghosts," he said aloud, more to himself than the others. "They bleed. They limp. They eat. That means they can be caught." Back at the cabin, Walter sat with a needle and thread. His hands shook more now than they used to. But he was steady enough. He pulled the square of quilted fabric from his coat, Daniel's shirt, and looked at it in the firelight. Time had faded the edges, worn it soft. He stitched it along the inside seam of his coat again, lower this time, tighter, so it wouldn't fall out if he moved fast. So it could be seen if needed. Not just a memory now, a signal. That night, as darkness claimed the forest, a fire was lit on the north ridge. It wasn't for warmth. It wasn't for light. It was a signal too, but not one meant to welcome. Flames climbed high, too fast, too wide. The kind of burn built with gasoline and anger. Walter smelled it before he saw it. A sick heat rising against the snow. He stepped out onto the porch, oil lamp in hand, and watched the line of orange paint the trees in silent warning. Inside the cabin, birch steps stood in the doorway, breath slow, fists clenched. And in the distance, downwind, past the smoke and fire, something else began to move. The smoke had settled into the snow like it meant to stay. By morning the wind had shifted, but the smell clung to everything. Wet pine, scorched sap, the chemical sting of accelerant. Black threads of soot tangled in the branches above South Meadow. The trees stood quiet, watching. What had burned wasn't just brush and kindling. It was the edge of a boundary no one had dared to cross until now. And someone had crossed it loud. Walter opened his door into a day that felt wrong in its silence. No birds, no wind. Just smoke curling like breath held too long. He could feel the heat still rising from the ridge, carried down in pockets, low and mean. It stuck in the back of his throat like a swallowed warning. He didn't hesitate. He filled 2 buckets with snow-packed water, hauled them with a grunt down the trail behind his cabin. Every 50 feet he stopped and scanned the trees, his ears strained for movement. Not words, just breath, maybe. Just presence. At the base of the hill he saw her. Matriarch stood across the clearing, directly in line with where the flame had licked the earth raw. She wasn't hiding this time. Her silhouette towered between the blackened trunks, arms at her sides, legs braced. Birch Step stood behind her, shoulders hunched, eyes bright and afraid, but refusing to back down. His fur had darkened with soot. Walter raised a hand. Not a greeting. A gesture of understanding. Of shame. They didn't move. Walter turned toward the growing line of fire eating through the underbrush at the tree line. No flames now, just ember trails and smoldering roots. The kind that could reignite with a single spark. He pulled the wet burlap from his pack and slapped it over the glowing patch. Steam hissing upward in tight white coils. Avery appeared behind him, panting, gloves blackened at the palms. "They hit both sides," she said. "Windward and backslope. Whoever did it knew the current." Walter didn't ask how she knew. She always knew. She pointed toward the north ridge, where smaller trees burned quicker and brighter. I saw 3 separate ignition points, spaced exactly. No way that's natural. They worked without speaking, dousing flare-ups with snow, stamping out char, laying wet cloths across half-dead root lines, their faces smeared with ash and effort. It was brutal, dirty work. But they didn't stop, and the matriarch still hadn't moved. Avery stood, sweat freezing at her collar. She's guarding something. Walter looked over his shoulder. Not something, he said. Someone. From the haze came a groan. Dry, guttural, not human. Birchstep's leg gave way, and he slumped to one side. But before either of them could react, Matriarch stepped into the smoke. Just one step. She lowered herself beside him, not cradling, not shielding, just presence, just being there. The boy steadied his breath, his fists unclenched. Then something snapped behind them, a loud crack, like a branch broken with intention. Walter turned fast. It was Rafe, standing 10 yards off, rifle slung casually across his shoulder, face flushed like a man who hadn't slept or eaten or listened to a damn thing in days. His jacket was dirty, his boots scorched around the soles, but his eyes held something worse than fire. Pride. Lula arrived seconds later, boots loud, voice sharper than the cold. Drop it. Rafe didn't. Lula's coat flapped as she stepped into the open, her badge glinting off the edge of her scarf. She wasn't smiling. You lit that fire? No proof of that, he said, voice slick. Just doing my civic duty, protecting the town. With gasoline? Rafe grinned. Looks like the ridge needed clearing anyway. Avery stepped forward. There are traps laid all through John's Brook. Hidden. Illegal. I've seen them. Lula didn't blink. And if I go up there now, I'll find them? You'll find Ash, he said. That's all that's left. Walter moved beside her. He didn't speak. But something about the stillness of him, coat still steaming from work, hands black with soot, made Rafe's smile falter. You got no case, Rafe muttered. They're not protected. They're not even registered. Lula took one slow step forward. Arson, hunting without a permit, possession of restricted traps, interference with ecological property. You want me to keep going? He scoffed, but it came out weak. Lula raised her radio. Deputy Collins, bring the truck. When Rafe opened his mouth again, the words didn't come. Just breath. Just panic hiding behind a face that no longer looked sure. Behind them, Matriarch stepped forward. She didn't charge. Didn't roar. She moved with a grace that shouldn't have belonged to something that size. Birchstep leaned on her side, his legs trembling, but he stood upright. His eyes didn't leave Rafe, and Rafe, finally, looked. Not at Lula, not at Avery, but at them. He stared too long. And then, something cracked. Not a sound, something in him. He dropped the rifle. They took him without struggle. Later, when the fire was out, when the traps were marked and cataloged and hauled off in plastic tubs, when Rafe had been processed for temporary holding at the district station, something appeared on the trail beside Walter's porch. A piece of pine, longer than usual, wider, polished smooth and still wet with sap. Scratched into the grain, deep and deliberate, was the same signal. Walter picked it up, thumb brushed the groove. It wasn't a thank you. It wasn't a warning. It was a call. He placed it on the step, didn't bring it inside. Avery met him on the trail later that day. She carried maps under her arm and a tin of cedar stakes in her pack. They walked to the ridgeline where the fire had eaten through the old growth. She pointed to the gaps in the canopy, marked each clearing, noted wind patterns and slope. We make it official, she said. Not with signs, not with tape, with understanding. We name it, we protect it, we educate the town. Walter nodded once. And we build. Simple, she said. Nothing modern, a footbridge, low profile. He smiled for the first time in days. Matriarch's Crossing, he said. She didn't ask how he knew. That night, long after the fire had gone out, Walter sat alone by the hearth. The coat hung nearby, and the square of Daniel's shirt sat in his palm, folded tight. He looked out the window. No snow, no whistle, but the silence carried weight. The weight of breath not yet taken. And out beyond the trees, where the smoke had once burned, something stirred again. The forest didn't whisper that morning. It groaned. The wind rolled low through the trees like something sick in its lungs. Walter knew that sound. It wasn't weather. It was warning. He stepped out of the cabin before sunrise, boots crunching the frost that had formed despite the fire's recent scar. Birch Step was gone, not just missing from the porch or the path, but absent in a way that the air itself noticed. No footprints, no blood, but something had shifted. Walter crouched near the edge of the wood line, where the boy usually lingered at dawn. His breath fogged in the quiet, and something under his ribs pulled tight. The pine needles were disturbed, scuffed. A tuft of fur, coarse and dark, clung to a thorned branch. And down beyond the ridge, past where the old snow had melted and refrozen into brittle crusts, a narrow groove traced the slope like someone had been dragged. He stood slowly, heart louder than it should have been, and reached into the inside seam of his coat. The fabric was still there. Daniel's shirt, stitched tight now, folded clean. He didn't hesitate. By the time Avery arrived, the sun had barely cleared the trees. "Something's wrong," she said, before he even spoke. Walter handed her the tuft of fur. "No blood," he said, but he didn't leave on his own. They found the first trail of blood near the mouth of the drop at Indian Head. Just a few spots, rust-colored, drying fast. Then more, a smear across stone, a scuff in the ice where someone had slipped hard and not recovered. Avery crouched down and ran gloved fingers over the ice ridge. "He fell," she whispered. "He's hurt." Walter didn't answer. His eyes had already moved to the trees beyond. That's when they saw the boot prints. Not Walter's, not Avery's. Deeper than either of them would leave. Wider stride, familiar in the worst way. Rafe. Walter said his name like a curse, his breath hissing between his teeth, and then the faintest sound. A groan carried uphill. It wasn't far. They moved fast now, slipping down the ledges like old climbers remembering muscles they thought they'd forgotten. The trees opened slightly into a hollow where the snow lay thinner, and light struck cold across the flat of a stone outcrop. Birch Step was there, slumped against a rock face, his leg twisted beneath him at an angle Walter had seen before. Walter moved first. No hesitation. His knees hit the snow hard. He reached gently, fingers brushing the boy's wrist, then shoulder. Still breathing. Still warm. Birch Step looked up, eyes clouded with pain, jaw clenched tight, but alive. Then a voice behind them. "Back off!" A rifle cocked. Rafe stood at the edge of the slope, face drawn tight with fury and something uglier. Regret, maybe. Maybe pride that had curdled. His boots were soaked, jacket torn at the shoulder, one sleeve dark with sap or blood or both. "I warned you," he said. "I told you these things don't belong here." Walter didn't flinch. "You set the fire," he said quietly. "You laid the traps. Now you want to finish what you started?" Rafe stepped forward. "I didn't start this. You did, by protecting it, feeding it, making it comfortable." He raised the barrel. Avery moved to Walter's side slowly. "You shoot," she said, voice flat. "And it won't matter what you think you saw. You'll be hunted by more than just the law." Empty threats. But his hand shook. Behind him, snow cracked. The sound was soft, barely there. A breath. Then Matriarch stepped out from the line of trees. Her form filled the space between light and shadow, every muscle taut beneath her massive frame. Her fur was wet in places, one shoulder singed from the fire. But her eyes were fixed on Rafe. He froze. Not out of fear, not yet, but something inside him recognized what stood before him wasn't beast. It was judgment, the kind that doesn't speak, the kind that chooses. Walter stood. He stepped forward between them, slow, open-palmed. Then he reached into his coat, pulled the square of quilted cloth from his inner seam, and held it up. No words, just the fabric. Time-worn, faded, sacred. He held it between them like a flag in no man's land. Matriarch stopped. Her breathing slowed. The snow around her shifted, but she held still. Even Birch Step lifted his head slightly. He saw it too. That cloth, that memory, that thread of something carried forward. Walter didn't lower his arm. He stood in the silence like a stone. Then the ground gave out, not from them, from underneath. A crack, deep, hollow, alive. The ice shelf at the lip of the ledge snapped. Rafe slipped. The rifle skidded away. His boot missed purchase. He toppled, arms flailing, legs scrambling for grip. And then, a massive hand shot forward. Matriarch lunged. Her arm extended across the ledge, shoulders straining, clawed fingers catching the back of his coat. He hung there, suspended over the drop, feet dangling. He didn't scream, just gasped. Matriarch didn't pull, not yet. She waited, made him feel it. Then, with a low rumble deep in her chest, she yanked. He hit the ground hard, coughing, elbows scraped, dignity gone. Walter knelt beside Birch Step again, checked the leg. The wound had opened, blood now thick in the snow. Avery tore her scarf into strips. They worked fast. Rafe sat where he'd fallen, staring. He didn't run, didn't speak, didn't touch the rifle that lay feet away. Because what do you say when the thing you tried to kill saves your life? What kind of man walks away from that unchanged? By the time they stood, Birch Step was semi-conscious. Walter and Avery lifted him carefully, bracing his weight across their shoulders. The matriarch walked behind them, not leading, not guarding, walking with them. And then it happened, soft, distant, a whistle, then another. And then many, faint, from all directions, echoing across the ridgelines like echoes of something older than speech. Walter looked up, eyes wide. They weren't alone. Not even close. The forest answered. By fall, the trees had turned to fire. Not the kind that scarred the ground, but the kind that burned slow in reds and golds, whispering change through every brittle leaf. South Meadow breathed again. What had once smelled of smoke and panic now carried the weight of fresh-cut lumber and pine shavings. No machines, no cables, just calloused hands, saws sharpened by memory, and timber shaped not for profit, but for passage. The footbridge rose quietly over the creek bed, a span of cedar planks, planed smooth and sealed with boiled linseed oil. No metal, only hand-forged nails and notched joints. The posts came from fallen trees, old ones already leaning. They didn't cut what wasn't given. Folks took to calling it Matriarch's Crossing before the final beam was laid, and the name stuck like bark to a living trunk. Walter was there the morning they mounted the sign. He didn't say much, just stood off to the side in his thick flannel coat, the quilt patch now stitched openly along the inside seam, thread fraying at the corners. He watched as Avery tapped in the last bolt with a rubber mallet, her breath fogging in the crisp air. She stepped back, wiped her brow, and nodded once. They'd made something real, not just for people, but for the space between. That same week, paper petitions passed from table to table inside Baxter's. No one handed them out. They just appeared, at the church foyer, near the register at the hardware store, beside the napkin dispenser at the diner. Simple sheets, handwritten header, in support of High Peak's passage, a living boundary. Beneath it, blank lines, names filled fast. Some signed with full hearts, some with quiet guilt. But they signed. Even Jack Morris. Even Darlene. Lula signed last. She didn't make a speech, just pushed the clipboard toward the counter and said, "Put it somewhere they'll see it." At the edge of the woods, new signs went up. Nothing fancy. Just wood, staked deep with words carved by steady hands. If you hear, step back, let pass. Another said, resin-marked wood one do not touch. There were no fences, no locked gates, just respect carved where it mattered. And Rafe, he served his time quiet, didn't fight the community labor sentence, didn't flinch when Lula handed him gloves and pointed toward the ridge line. The burn scar hadn't healed, but saplings had started to push through. His job was simple: remove the old wire, marked the land he'd tried to silence. Walter watched him one afternoon. Crouched in the ash, cutting away rusted snares like tumors. His hands moved different now. Slower, more careful. No one said he'd changed, but no one said he hadn't either. Autumn deepened. Then came the first frost. That night Walter woke to a familiar sound. Not wind, not the creak of trees. Something finer. A knock, not on the door. On the air. He opened the door with calm hands. Cold air spilled in, clean and dry. And there on the top step, bathed in the quiet silver of moonlight, rested a new piece of pine. Smaller than the others. Smoother. The pitch had dried to a golden crust. The edges beveled like it had been shaped by finger, not blade. Walter lifted it slowly, turned it in his palm. The mark was clean, sharper than before. Not a warning, a goodbye. He stepped outside, looked toward the edge of the woods. They were there. Matriarch stood just beyond the first row of trunks, still as stone, tall and solemn. Beside her, birch step stood upright, posture sure. His limp was faint now. He shifted his weight like someone learning the rhythm of their own strength. They didn't move forward. They didn't wave. Walter nodded. And from the far tree line, where the forest curled in on itself and the moonlight began to fall away, a soft chorus began. Whistles, not loud, not frantic. Just breath, carried on cold air. A chain of farewells. Walter stayed at the door long after the shapes had gone. His hands closed around the resin-marked pine. Inside, the lamp flickered low. Avery stopped by the next day, ready to walk the bridge and check the northern post markers. She knocked. No answer. The cabin was warm inside. The stove still held coals. The bed was neat. His coat hung in its place, the patch of Daniel's shirt sewn smooth along the lining. And on the small table beside the hearth, a bowl sat empty. Cleaned, dried. Next to it, a folded scrap of fabric. Avery understood before the others came. No signs of struggle. No last letter. Just quiet. Out beyond the footbridge, past where the creek sang over stones, the edge of the forest now bore a new carving, small and low, beneath the main plaque. He left the world kinder than he found it. No one claimed it. But those who walked the path in the early dusk swore the air there felt different, gentler. They said sometimes, when you walked past Matriarch's crossing with your coat zipped high and your breath coming fast, you might hear it again. A whistle, soft. Just enough to know you weren't alone. And in winter, when the snow blanketed the trees and silence settled in thick, you might look across the creek and swear you saw it. A shape. Too still to be storm, too large to be shadow. And if you looked away too fast, you might miss it. But if you stood long enough, quiet enough, open enough, you'd know. Somewhere between the trees and memory, something still watched over the passage. Sometimes the most powerful stories aren't told out loud. They're felt, in the quiet between breaths, in the frost that forms on a window just before dawn, in the weight of a hand that chooses to hold rather than strike. Some truths don't need names. They live in the way we show up for each other, especially when no one's watching. We forget, in all our hurry, how much of the world runs on silent agreements. A bowl left out on a porch. A path cleared without being asked. A signal shared between two beings who'll never speak the same language, but understand each other all the same. There is a sacredness in that kind of knowing. A reverence that doesn't shout or claim, but simply is. This wasn't a story about monsters. It never was. It was about what happens when we stop seeing the unknown as threat and start seeing it as invitation. An invitation to listen more deeply, to step more gently, to make space for something we may never fully understand, but can still choose to respect. Because sometimes the lines we draw between us and them are the very things keeping us from becoming whole. In the end, we don't carry legacy in the loud things, not in headlines or monuments or noise. We carry it in the way we treat those with no voice and no vote, in the way we tend to places we didn't build, but are lucky enough to pass through. in the way we show our children what it means to leave the world just a little kinder than we found it. And maybe that's the point. Maybe the greatest kind of strength isn't domination. It's restraint. The greatest kind of power isn't control. It's trust. And the deepest kind of love doesn't need words. It only needs presence. So wherever you are tonight, whether near a fire or alone in the dark, whether you believe in things not yet proven or simply long for something bigger than yourself, remember this. Not everything sacred makes a sound, but it's listening. And it remembers kindness like a trail remembers the feet that move gently over it. Thank you for walking this path with us. If this story moved you in some way, we'd love to hear your thoughts. Leave us a comment below, share your reflections, and if you'd like to walk alongside us again, consider subscribing to the channel. Your voice matters here. And who knows, your words might be the quiet signal someone else has been waiting for. Until next time, travel kindly and listen for the silence that speaks back.